Hello everyone, welcome back to Women in Film Reviews. My name is Helen, and today we are going to be talking about Emma. Period. No, really, look at the film's poster. That's how we're supposed to say it, apparently. Before we get into this, I just want to let you guys know that I am a huge Jane Austen fan. In addition to reading several of her books, the 2005 version of Pride and Prejudice is among my favorite movies, and I did watch it as part of my comfort movie week, which you can read a little bit more about on my website, helen-grotheis.com. There are several different versions of Emma, but when this version was announced, I knew the minute I heard about it that I had to go see it in cinemas. And, as it turned out, it is currently the most recent film I saw in cinemas. Thanks, COVID. Oh, by the way, I am not going back to cinemas until it is, absolutely safe to go back. You cannot pay me to go to a cinema right now. Emma, full stop, was released in the UK on Valentine's Day 2020, and it received a limited release in the US followed by a wide one. Or at least it would have been. Thanks, COVID! This version of Emma is directed by Autumn de Wilde, who is a photographer, and is written by novelist Eleanor Catton, and interestingly enough, both of them are making their feature film debuts here. The film cost $10 million approximately to make, and it did take in about $25 million at the box office worldwide before cinemas unfortunately had to shut. It also currently retains an 87% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Emma is based on the 1815 novel by Jane Austen and follows the exploits of the titular character, a rich heiress who has no desire to marry but has a penchant for matchmaking among her peers, much to the disdain of her neighbor Mr. Knightley. When she comes across a poor schoolgirl named Harriet, Emma conspires to find a match for her, only to discover along the way the many consequences of her meddling in the lives of her fellow villagers in Highbury. So, as for Austen adaptations, I did mention that I like the Pride and Prejudice from 2005, but the other adaptations, especially the ones in the 90s, have fallen a little bit flat for me. I've seen the 1996 version of Emma once or twice, but wasn't really enamored with it, and it did not really inspire me to read the book. The only other Austen adaptation I have to say that I really love is, what else? Clueless! Yes, for those of you who don't know, and you probably should at this point because it's been 25 years, Clueless, starring Alicia Silverstone and directed by Amy Heckerling, is a loose adaptation of Emma. Apart from the very obvious difference in time period from the Regency area to the mid-1990s, Clueless and the 1996 version of Emma actually have quite a difference of tone. The 1996 version tends to play it more straight-laced as a star vehicle for Gwyneth Paltrow, while the 1995 Clueless is first and foremost a comedy. A romantic comedy, but a comedy nonetheless. I would argue that this version of Emma, the 2020 version with the full stop, is more akin to Clueless and has more in common with that than it does with the 1996 adaptation. That being said, do not be deterred by the Regency era dialogue because there's a lot of it. If you haven't seen the movie before but you have seen Clueless, you will fit right in with the story. And even if this is your very first introduction to Emma, I'd say it's pretty easy to follow. It is really refreshing to see a direct adaptation of Emma, and really of any Austen work, that realizes that the books that Austen wrote are more comedy and satire than they are straight stories. I mean, Pride and Prejudice is probably the most serious of all of them, but I think that there's a stigma about period pieces needing to be all stuffy and dramatic, and the stakes were so high. Jane Austen wrote 5 books, just taking the piss out of everybody that she knew in the time period that she lived in. I watched quite a bit of the behind the scenes content to get a little bit more context of how they approached this movie, and the thing that kind of stuck with me is that Autumn de Wilde, along with everybody who was involved with this project, was interested in finding the comedy of the customs and the time period because there's a lot of funny stuff that would have been normal for them but that we would find fascinating and funny. A lot of that does have to do with the cast. Anya Taylor-Joy, she is Emma. One of the problems that I had with the 1996 version is that although Gwyneth Paltrow did a fine job playing Emma, I never really saw Emma the character, and I just saw Gwyneth the actress putting on a part. And even though I know who Anya Taylor-Joy is and I've seen her in other movies, she absolutely embodies this character. She disappears into it. She is Emma, and you would not be able to have the movie that you do with this film without a magnetic performance like hers. The rest of the supporting cast is great. Bill Nighy is a scene stealer as Emma Woodhouse's father. He's just the biggest hypochondriac, and it is quite funny watching his poor servants try to tend to him. Another one that I think is a good scene stealer is Miranda Hart as Miss Bates. Miss Bates in the novel is meant to be just a bit annoying to Emma, and since the novel is told from Emma's point of view, we kind of see her in that way. She's very rambly, she knows about everything. And Miranda Hart is absolutely the perfect actress to take on this role. She plays the comedy bits really well, but there are a couple more serious moments with her too. The biggest standout for me, I have to say, was Josh O'Connor as Mr. Elton. If you're like me, you've watched all seasons of The Crown and you watched the most recent season, probably not long before Emma came out. And the difference between Josh O'Connor's Prince Charles and Josh O'Connor's geeky, gawky Mr. Elton is night and day. He plays unlikable so well, and so does Tanya Reynolds, who eventually plays Mrs. Elton. She is the exact bourgeoisie person that you just love to hate. The humor with Mr. and Mrs. Elton is that they are about as unself-aware as two humans in this world can be. Speaking of the world of the film, the visuals. I know that there's always talk about the visuals of period pieces. No matter what, they're always up for those Oscars. Even then though, this version of Emma tends to differentiate itself from other period pieces, mainly because there is just so much color and so much range of color. There's a lot of pastels involved. The bourgeoisie, the part that Emma is from, and her family, they just have all these colorful garments and some ostentatious garments, which are again brought to the forefront by Mrs. Elton. And then you have the rugged nature of Mr. Knightley, who just, he doesn't have much of a care for how he appears. So apart from this one yellow coat he has, he tends to dress in kind of plain, dark colors. The lower class in Highbury tend to dress in kind of drab colors as well. They all manage to pop against the landscapes and the environments that they're in. Miraculously, I think most of this movie was shot on location. They talked quite a bit on the DVD about how they found these gorgeous buildings to be able to use for Highbury and for Hartfield, which is Emma's house. It just came together. I also love the fact that they had a female production designer and set decorator. This just has a woman's touch all over it, and I love it. The result of the use of all this color in the sets and the costumes is that it actually heightens the absurdity of all these different situations and of the customs of the period. One example that I can think of is that the men just have these super high collars. Mr. Elton in particular, his vicar's outfit is incredibly poofy. It's just, you know that these characters do not find these clothes comfortable, and yet this is what they're expected to be in when they're out in society. It all puts the idea of them putting on a front at the forefront. And we do get to see little out of custom moments, such as Emma trying to warm her bum by the fire by lifting up her dress, Mr. Knightley just taking off his jacket and lying down in the middle of his gigantic foyer in his mansion. So often in the book you see these characters, how they would be out in society, and it's nice to get a peek of them behind closed doors. As far as adaptations go, there are quite a few deleted scenes on the disc. Some of them I can see why they left them out. Some of them are more establishing scenes that ultimately we didn't need in the final cut. But I feel like some of these scenes should have been left in, particularly some scenes that involve Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax. Frank Churchill, of course, is Emma's sort of love interest. He is mentioned quite a bit. He is the adopted nephew of Lady Churchill and Mr. Weston's biological son, and he's not the greatest character. You definitely see this more in the book. It turns out that he and Jane Fairfax have had this secret engagement, and he comes to visit Highbury and has to pretend that he doesn't know her and that they're not engaged, but he does this a bit too well. They do soften him up a bit in the movie as opposed to his persona in the book, but the 2 deleted scenes just show him being overly flirty with Emma in front of Jane, and I think we could have left those in the movie just to make us dislike him more, and it would really solidify the fact that no, Frank Churchill isn't really for Emma before we know that he's actually off the market, and it would push us a bit more in the direction of her belonging to Knightley. Not belonging to Knightley, belonging with Knightley. It doesn't detract too much from the movie, but I feel like it could have added that extra flavor. Oh, before we move on, we have to talk about the music because it is such an interesting mix of operatic and classical pieces, as well as some folk songs and hymns from the era, and the arrangements are just great. The lightness of the operatic stuff in particular, it somehow fits Emma, who's just comes off as this light and airy heiress. I don't know, something about it just really sets it in the period for me. Maybe that's what does it. So of course, since this is Women in Film Reviews, we're going to talk a little bit about how feminism makes itself known in the movie, or other feminist readings you can take from it. One thing that I want to talk about in particular is just Emma herself and how she's portrayed. In the 1996 version, and as well as other TV adaptations, some of Emma's more unlikable characteristics, such as her selfishness, her haughtiness, they tend to be downplayed quite a bit in order to make her a more likable protagonist. This ultimately does a disservice to how she as a character grows in the book. She has to grow quite a bit, but if she's already softened, we don't feel as invested in wanting her to get better. This Emma, however, gets to be selfish, naive, and a know-it-all, while also being a very sympathetic character. We see how she meddles with Harriet's relationship, but at the same time, she also cares for her father quite deeply. She's not perfect, but she doesn't need to be. None of us are. For example, we can agree with Emma that Miss Bates can be quite annoying when she rambles on, and at the same time, we can be absolutely horrified and disappointed in Emma when she insults her on the picnic. Put it this way, we know that Cher Horowitz is a flawed human being, but if we can accept Cher Horowitz as the icon that she is, we can accept Emma since she has pretty much the same flaws. Even though you see that she's flawed, you are rooting for her to better herself by the end. And even though it's hard for her, it is super satisfying to see her take responsibility for the things that she's done to the other people in her circle. I mean, really, we've all been in situations where we've said something that we regret a lot to someone that we care deeply about. And you ultimately need to apologize, and there's no guarantee that things will be okay in the end. We can also talk about feminism in terms of Emma and Harriet's relationship. The friendship between Emma and Harriet is treated with the utmost importance. Yes, Emma is kind of using Harriet as a pawn to amuse herself, but they actually become quite good friends, and Emma cares deeply about her by the end of the film. And in fact, even when Emma is proposed to by Mr. Knightley, she actually refuses because she knows that Harriet is in love with Mr. Knightley, and she doesn't want to break Harriet's heart. They only get married once Harriet and Mr. Martin have found their own happily ever after. I think it's such important to see that even in a world where marriage is kind of the end goal for a lot of women, there's still quite a bit of importance placed on the relationship that women have with each other. Another thing is that I can see early on in production that maybe some executives were worried about how they might market this movie to men. And to that I say, Women are 50% of the world population and we can still give you big box office results. In any case, I bring this up because a lot of Austen adaptations are modified and modernized to make their dialogue more acceptable to modern audiences. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I think the Pride and Prejudice 2005 version does it okay, but I don't know. The 1996 version of Emma is just gonna, now that I have this version, everything about it is inferior. In any case, much of the dialogue from this movie, some of which I think is a bit more modernized, is actually lifted directly from the book. I read the book after I saw this movie, and I could not count the number of times I just stumbled upon a quote from the book and being like, oh, that's how they said it in the film. And even not reading the book, I completely understood what was going on in the film the first time I saw it. You don't need to dumb it down for the audience. If you're gonna set it in a period piece, use the dialogue that came with it. We can also talk about the fact that unlike the other female protagonists in Austen's books, Emma is born well off, and she doesn't need to concern herself with marrying someone with a really high allowance. She already has it. But the movie also reminds us that marriage is still of great importance to a woman of lower stature, such as Harriet or Jane Fairfax, or even Miss Bates, who has remained unmarried this whole time and lives in relative poverty. It highlights the fact that Emma can essentially choose to marry for love, but it also understands that the other characters who are looking for husbands don't necessarily have that luxury. But even though Harriet and Jane Fairfax do need to marry a husband who has a certain amount of money in order for them to be financially okay, both of them do end up marrying the people that they love. Harriet to Mr. Martin and Jane to Frank Churchill. Although, that being said, we aren't given the strongest indication that Jane and Churchill are gonna have the happiest marriage, considering what an a-hole Frank Churchill is throughout the whole book. My point being, they are allowed to marry and be happy and also have some financial wealth, even though they don't marry millionaires. On the whole, I think this is a very good adaptation. I think this is the one that gets the tone of the book the most. I think it's rather interesting that one of the three major film adaptations of Emma, including Clueless, the one that was directed by a man, is played extremely straight as opposed to for comedic purposes. And for this 2020 adaptation in particular, it took two people who are almost completely new to the feature film world and come from different mediums of creativity, that being photography for Autumn de Wilde and novels and prose for Eleanor Catton, to really bring a fresh perspective to the story of Emma. I do applaud the novelist in Eleanor Catton for realizing that the dialogue that worked so well in the prose version in the book would actually translate well to screen, and I don't think we would have gotten that. Likewise, I don't think we wouldn't have gotten the visual attention to detail that someone like Autumn de Wilde as a photographer could bring to this if we had people that have been working just in films and in screenplays their entire lives. This version of Emma pops very well. That being said, we do need to address the elephant in the room. This is a very white piece of literature and therefore a very white piece of film. I do enjoy this movie because I love a little romantic comedy, but I also need to realize that this is a story about white upper class people that may not sit well with others. There's nothing super problematic in it, but there is a very glaring lack of diversity on and behind the screen. I think we've seen with Clueless that this can be adapted in a way that almost nobody would have imagined for it maybe 30 years prior. But the premise of Emma is actually so much fun and I think is very translatable to other mediums, other time periods, and I would love to see an artist of color take this on, or an LGBT artist, or just, I would love to see even more diverse and interesting takes on the story of Emma. and it's kind of disheartening that we haven't really gotten many of those yet. Overall, I would say that this version of Emma is a very unique and interesting take on a story that has been told several times over. I really enjoyed it. I like it way more than the 90s version, but I think I would still have to put Clueless slightly above this version because, I mean, it's a classic. Who can argue with that? And don't worry, I will talk about Clueless eventually on my channel because I have a lot of thoughts. I just need to get my behind the scenes book back from America. As for what I hope this version inspires, there's the diverse versions that I mentioned before, but I also want to see versions of other Austen works that are just straight adaptations of the books but emphasize the comedic element a bit more. As I say, I like some of these versions just fine, but I find a lot of humor in the books and I want to see that translated to screen properly. It is a shame that more people didn't get to see it in cinemas, and it's not really the general population's fault, and the cinema shutting down was for the best in order to protect people, but I hope that more people do get to see it on the big screen in the future anyways, when it's safe to do so. I would say that more than other Austen adaptations, I think this is a really good in for someone who has never seen or read any Austen work before. I guess what I'm trying to say with all of this movie is proof that you can make a straight adaptation of an Austen work, or any period piece, and not make it be stale. Thank you guys so much for watching. I had a lot of fun making this review. If you liked this video, you can subscribe below to hear more Women in Film reviews every other Thursday, and you can view the other reviews that are already available on my channel. You can also subscribe to my vlog channel where I actually recently talked about my experience reading Emma for the first time as part of the 2020 reading rush. If you aren't already, you should become one of my £5 patrons over on Patreon. Tim and I just recorded our first exclusive movie commentary that will go up every month. I won't tell you what the movie was, but I'm super excited, and that will be up before September 30th hits. Do not worry, but in the meantime, you can go sign up and be ready when it hits. Make sure to follow me on Twitter, on Instagram, on my Facebook page. All of the links that I've mentioned in this video will be in the description down below. Thanks again for watching. Remember to keep living awesome lives, and I will see you all very soon. Bye.